Good afternoon, everybody. I am Judith Silva. My role is Global Sustainable Development Director at Arup. And that role is about trying to get an organization, a design organization of about 17,000 people globally, to shape a sustainable future. Our mission is to make sure that sustainable development is absolutely everything we do. But a sustainable future, at the moment, is very much focused on the immediacy of the crises we face as a result of climate change, nature loss, and inequity. And I was reflecting yesterday, watching Her Majesty's funeral, on the changes that have happened in the world in the 70 years that she was our monarch. And those changes are very, very significant. And the window of time to reverse the damage we've caused to date is shrinking on a daily basis. But actually focusing on a sustainable future and what we need to do now, and by now I mean this decade, which is halving emissions, getting to net zero, reversing nature loss, and eliminating poverty, which is all wrapped up in the Sustainable Development Goals. Those are just a milestone on the journey that we're on to create a future for the human race, and in fact for many other living things on this planet. I never talk about sustainability. My job title isn't the Chief Sustainability Officer. My job title is the Global Sustainable Development Director, and that's because I believe in sustainable development as a process rather than sustainability as what became a fairly wishy-washy movement. But where we need to get to is beyond sustainable. We need to get to regenerative. Sustainable will get back to the equilibrium. It may assure the future of the next few generations, but it's not going to ensure the future of generations to come for hundreds of years. And that's why I find the regenerative futures conversation incredibly compelling. And I think it's our duty not just to look at the short term, but to think longer ahead and to imagine what that future might be. And I started this work with our foresight team with the publication Future Scenarios a few years ago. And on the way, I've met some amazing people, and I'm delighted this afternoon to be joined by 4 amazing people who are going to share their insights in terms of what will it actually take to transition to a regenerative future. So that's practical. What are the barriers? What are the obstacles? What are the changes in the way we think and feel that are going to make us act differently? So I'll begin at the far end in order with Amy Hogden. Amy works for, she's the Chief Design Officer of Biofabricate. She trained as a textile designer, and she's focused her career on biofabrication, which you might call just growing materials for our future. Next to her is Stephen Jameson, who's the Global Head of Circular Economy at SAP. And there he leads the creation and development of industry solutions needed to keep products in use, design out waste, and regenerate natural systems. And I think importantly, Stephen's focused on real go-to-market strategies and commercializing these solutions early on. And next we have Michael Paulin, who is an architect and founded his practice Exploration in 2007, which is focused on biometric architecture and innovation. Michael's been a real thought leader in regenerative design, and he's the author of Flourish, Design Paradigms for a Planetary Emergency, which is on my recommended essential reading list for everyone at Arup, and I recommend it to all of you. It's a fantastic book. Thank you for writing it. And then finally, last but not least, Judith Vanderboom, who is a designer, maker, researcher, and educator, and she currently leads the MA in regenerative design at Central St. Martin's. And she's had a long career in education, and is very focused on issues of relatedness as being really important to who we are and what we do. And explores interconnectedness through collaborations. So I want to begin, Michael, with you and your brilliant book, Flourish. And what I really liked about Flourish is it really talked about what we need to change in our minds, how we need to think differently in order to do differently. It's unfair to ask you to do a synopsis of Flourish, but could you sort of share with us what you think are the sort of key things from that book that people need to really appreciate?
Sure, thanks, Jo. And Flourish is co-authored with Sarah Ichioka. So we did focus very much on cultural shifts. And I think there has been quite a difference. You know, if you went to an event about sustainability 5 years ago, it probably would have been a lot about technology. And what Sarah and I think is that you know, the outcome of any particular technology is very dependent on the mindset behind it. So for instance, 3D printing based on a kind of conventional sustainable mindset could easily result in us being drowned in tons of plastic consumerist crap. Whereas with a regenerative mindset, 3D printing could be genuinely transformative. So Sarah and I argue that we need 5 really fundamental shifts to make this transformation from sustainable to regenerative, starting with a transformation of our ideas of agency. The second chapter is about rethinking our relationship with the rest of the living world, overcoming the dualistic separation of humans and nature. And we try and describe what that actually means, so it's not just about philosophy, we're quite practical as well. Chapter 3 is about rethinking our ideas of time, making the case for long-term thinking. In chapter 4, we talk about how we need to rethink how we see ourselves as humans, and actually a lot of the narratives we've been told about humans being kind of selfish and just in a competitive zero-sum game are actually scientifically wrong. You know, there's a lot to be said for the way that humans are actually unparalleled in our capacity for altruism and cooperation. And if you were to design the built environment based on a starting point that's much more positive about humans, it would lead to something much more like the 15-minute city. And then in the final chapter, we examine the whole story of growth, and we come to the conclusion that neither growth nor degrowth are good purposes for driving an economy, and what we should actually be aiming for is the maximization of planetary health.
I think that's brilliant that you've summarised it so succinctly. Stephen, I want to turn to you because one of the things that the book talks about is agency, is about the role of designers and practitioners in creating that new regenerative future. And when we talked last week, you talked about the need for them to broaden their horizons. Would you like to expand on that?
Sure. So I think just to give a little bit of, I guess, context to this. So, you know, we at SAP were looking across so much of the world's economy. I think something like 88% of the world's commerce will touch our systems at some point. And so across every industry, across every part of that material flow, if you like, think of building materials and the journey that may go on into construction and then beyond life. There are so many of those different touch points that you know, we will have visibility on. And so much of I guess the opportunity for change comes from the level of agency that, you know, individuals, but most importantly businesses and business leaders are actually taking in terms of tackling these problems. We see, you know, in different parts of the economy, in different parts of the world, the ideas of things like extended producer responsibility for not just building materials, but for, you know, consumer products as well as being key. But what so often happens is they're only able to go so far. They're only able to give you that visibility into the next part of that supply chain, you know, the people that sold you that material, the people that sold you that product. And as soon as you break that link for that sort of single transaction to that person that supplied you that material, you really have no insight in terms of what happens, you know, right through to the ultimate land use impact, the ultimate extraction of that material. And the reality is, if we're actually to tackle this, we need to be able to get that full system insight. We need to be able to see the impact of design decisions, of buying decisions, right through to that impact, not just on the environmental context, but also on the societal context within that. So it's hugely important. You know, we can find point solutions, we can find niche innovations, but when we really think about how we scale that on a global context, across every material flow, across every scenario, it's not just good enough to do this for building materials, right? We need to think about this for all the other sort of technical materials and biological materials that we consume each day. if we're not able to have that broader context, then we're really stuck in terms of the actions that we can take in order to scale. And so I guess that's where that's our starting point.
And is that becoming possible because of digital technology and the amount of data available? I mean, how far off being able to do that are we?
I'd say it's becoming more possible. I don't think there's anything sort of unique about digital in the last sort of few years that makes that suddenly miraculously possible. I think there's the connectedness of our businesses, of our communities, have provided opportunities for decades, really, in terms of our ability to access this insight. The challenge is how you bring together not just the technology component, but the standards, the regulations, the political will, alongside the will of investors and shareholders, in order to be able to line up these interests and ensure that we can agree some degree of consistency. When nations take kind of well-meaning activity that is, at the end of the day, based on a particular nation, as soon as you look to a global supply chain, that system quickly breaks down. And so how to do that across borders, how to do that in a global system is really the challenge. So yes, technology and data provides an opportunity, but it's collaboration together which really helps us find the answers.
Yeah, and what you've touched on there is the importance of actually thinking in terms of the value chain. And as designers, as practitioners, I think we have a unique place because we sit bang in the middle of that value chain. We can look in one direction and we find developers and investors. We look in the other direction and we find contractors, material suppliers. Amy, that's where you are working with people who are innovating, creating new types of materials. Can you share with us a bit more about what Biofabricate are doing?
Yes, so at Biofabricate, we're very interested, or our sort of vision is a sustainable material world built with biology and not oil. So we work with a range of brands and investors, but a lot with startups who are looking to nature to learn how we might build things differently, the materials that we use, the chemicals, the ingredients. Because I think there's a lot in the way that we have designed or created or obtained materials in the past is very extractive. So and I think there was a great point made in the first panel, which was, there was this assumption that nature is endless and is for free. And actually, we think we're very, very clever as humans, but actually nature is far clever in how it builds, in the systems that it has, and that there needs to be some sort of humility into how we look at learning from what it builds. So a concrete example of that is there's a startup which was actually founded by an architect who are looking to grow cement. And they have found a naturally occurring organism that will build cement in the same way that coral reefs are formed. So, and it's additive in the fact that you can take waste aggregate from something like the mining industry. They're called Jamieson, they're incredible, you should look them up. Where you can take that waste aggregate, you introduce the bacteria, and they produce essentially biological limestone. So they're actually adding to the limestone reserves of the planet, rather than what we do now, which is dig it up, mix it with clay. And this is a very reductive way of describing how we make sort of cement. Heat it up to vast temperatures, just so that we can add water back in and create concrete. Their process happens at ambient temperatures. They get to full strength in, I think, 72 hours. Traditional concrete takes about, I think it's like 28 days or something like that. So looking at these types of technologies, how can we learn from the way that nature builds and also collaborate with living microorganisms to make the materials for our sort of built environment? So and we work with them and a range of different innovators to sort of help push that field further and try and get them implemented in as many places as possible. And really just to educate everyone on this sort of growing field of innovators who are working with biology.
And that's really exciting, but it's also you saying that nature, although it's renewable resources, is still a resource that we're exploiting. When I became a professional civil engineer, I wrote to the institution and complained because their definition of civil engineering is that you harness the forces of nature for the good of mankind. And I have a fundamental problem with that because, I respect nature as much as people, and I feel I'm part of nature as a human being. Judith, I know this is very much, the line of thinking that you believe in terms of the interrelatedness of all of us, is that something that feeds into the education in regenerative design that you're doing?
I definitely have something to say that. I think a lot of things have been tapped on, also in the previous panels, but yeah, of course it's a yes, I wouldn't say no. I think fundamentally when I look at education, or maybe then an MA regenerative design puts a lot of spotlight on this session here today, but I think we really look at how do we live together and what do these principles mean. So we work with designers from all over the world, from all kinds of professions of design, and it's about kind of standing still and unlearning the principles of design, thinking about how does it mean to, how can we do no harm in our processes? How do we understand life? Because there's a definite lack of eco-literacy, not only in design, and it's been mentioned before, it's in education in general. How do we understand life? How, if we don't even know how it is that we're able to breathe or live together, how are we actually able to design? And if we don't understand what it means to be together, and that I mean in a human way, but also in a non-human way. And then with a non-human, I also have a problem with that word a little bit, but maybe we can jump on it later. Because I think it's so important that we have a deeper understanding of understanding the species ourselves. How do we intend to be human? So what's our intention? So it's important to look inward and change from the, I would say, from the ego that reigns a lot to an ecological perspective. And I know a lot of, I've just been course leader for many years, and a lot of my students say, I just want to design pretty things. I'm like, I remember that when I was in school as well. And you can do beautiful things, but what is more beautiful than that you can give life by working with others and with species, and not just for humans, but that you actually look at the whole living system. And I think that is what we're most passionate about. And I think central is, if you look at my team, we work with 2 people, we're a small team, we're with 3 people. I come in from design. We have an ecologist and we have an anthropologist. Our anthropologist comes from India and is very invested in the global south. So we talk about decolonization in many levels. So just understanding that ecological and social justice and living together is tied together, but we have to have a very practical discussion, but also a philosophical discussion on how do we intend to be human? What future do we want to lead into? So education is a really exciting part to be part of.
Yeah. And I think it's inspiring that, you know, there are master's programs on regenerative design. Michael, we're about the same vintage. I read your bio. And certainly, you know, when I studied, it was all technocratic. Neither the environment nor people featured. You know, do you think that the sort of the legacy of people like us being in the positions we are in the world is actually hindering this transition to a regenerative future? Do we have to wait for the people that are on Judith's master's program to come through? Or can we, as practitioners, as leaders in our own organizations, be doing something to realize that transition faster?
Well, we don't have to just sort of accept what we were taught. We can challenge that, and I've been getting more and more interested in a theory called spirodynamics, which is a theory of the evolution of human consciousness. And you know, there is a series of sort of steps that are fairly clear that humanity has passed through, and generally it's about an expansion of perspectives. And so, you know, a long way back, humans would have had a very individualistic perspective. That expanded to a tribal perspective, then a national perspective, and then an international one. And now we need to expand that to a planetary perspective. And I think there's a good chance that we will look back on the pandemic as the moment at which we came to the end of human exceptionalism. You know, the idea that somehow humans can exist outside the laws of physics and biology. So coming back more specifically to your point, you know, we can choose to grow as individuals, and if we're leading organizations, we can choose to grow those organizations. And I think it's absolutely certain that people coming into the workplace are going to expect new things of organizations. Our kids will not respect us just for being wealth creators. We need to rise to a much higher purpose as humans. And Sarah and I have argued that the new purpose that we could aspire to as designers is as co-enablers of the flourishing of all life for all time.
Can I just add something to that age gap thing that was arising here? I think I'm also not 20 anymore, but like when I look at the students that sign up, my oldest student is 52. They run a cotton farm in Australia. So what I really love is that it's not age bound, and yes, you see a younger generation stepping up, but everybody is kind of in their career saying, I kind of want to become an ex-designer, an ex-architect. I don't want to contribute anymore to these value chains that we're in of. And I find it very kind of, I don't know, it builds a new community of people from all kind of multi-generational, different cultures, different ages, all saying we want to make a change. And I think that is that kind of force that we need together, instead of seeing, well, the quite wide education we have in the design sometimes, to kind of break that open. So it's been encouraging.
Yeah, no, I think it is encouraging. Stephen, how do you see that playing out in your organisation?
I think we always try and look from the kind of the broadest context possible, and look at the question on the kind of global scale. And a couple of the big sort of problem statements we've been looking at recently are things like 4.9 billion people in the world don't have access to waste infrastructure. There's no opportunity for bringing materials back into some kind of flow. Therefore, the opportunity to free up space to regenerate nature is challenged. You look at what's actually required in, let's say, the global south to switch to more sort of regenerative agricultural principles. Essentially, you're asking people to forego their livelihood or forego a yield in order to be able to support a new way of doing things. And so there's genuine challenges and barriers that are very material that need to be overcome in order for us to be able to make progress on this agenda. And so the question has got to be, how do you connect the minds of designers, the people that are actually able to make those decisions at the most critical point? What is it we say, 80% of environmental impacts are made at design time? And so how can we twist that and enable that influence, that ingenuity that's sort of coming through the design community now? And how do you enable that to actually connect to those communities all around the world who actually need to adapt, need to change? And how do you provide the opportunity to those participants and to those communities in order to support what they need to do in that in that process?
No, I mean, listening to you speak, I sort of, I wonder whether actually we can't get to a regenerative future unless we first abandon the concept, which I abandoned a long time ago personally, of perpetual growth, because it just doesn't work. It's like the second law of thermodynamics is a law, it's proven. We have one planet. We can't continue to grow either the population and or the amount that they feel they need globally. It's an equation that simply doesn't balance. And that's why I go back always to sort of Brundtland's definition, which is about the needs of current generations. And I'm interested in this sort of material thing, because who owns the materials? Where in the value chain does the materials really come from? And I've worked with tribal communities, and I've worked in a lot in the global south. And there you work with communities, and the materials are on their doorstep. When I was building roads in Africa in a refugee situation, I couldn't import materials. I needed to do it and do it now. And the local people knew what sand, what gravel was suitable for building roads. And eventually the road disintegrates and it goes back to nature. Are you finding examples of indigenous knowledge about materials, local knowledge about materials, and then bringing that together with sort of science and knowledge from afar, like Stephen mentions, to sort of enable new things to happen?
Absolutely, and I think it's really important. I think it was also mentioned on one of the previous panels that so much of sort of these new ideas come from very ancient knowledge, and that there is sort of humility all around that's needed, and not to impose on nature or in different places, to really look at what's happening locally in that sort of space and place. There's one example that's happening. There's an architectural firm called Red House Studio, and they're working with a local community in Namibia. And there's a problem with encroaching bush that's happened, which is taking away from the grassland, which is a sort of an ecological problem. that's happening, and what they're doing is sort of taking that biomass, using it to grow mushrooms. So there's a local sort of food and revenue stream that's happening there. And then what happens when you grow mushrooms is the root system of mushrooms is called Mycelium. It's nature's incredible recycler. It's amazing. I think the biggest living organism on Earth is actually a mycelium in Oregon. It's about like, I don't know, like 4 square miles, or it's like multiple football pitches. It's massive, you know. And what they do is it locks. It's like sort of a web. It locks together sort of biomass. And what they do is they take those sort of blocks where you've grown the mushrooms and they compress it, and it creates a building material that's very lightweight, it's fire resistant, it's compostable should you want to compost it, and it's incredibly local. So it's something that's very much being looked at for a local problem and also being used to create sort of habitat and buildings in that place. So I think it's really about sort of looking at specific areas and what are sort of applications in those spaces.
And is that about building on indigenous knowledge, or is that about exploiting materials that new discoveries of new materials?
I mean, sort of, I think mycelium have been around for millennia. It is bringing in, so it's local knowledge around what is a problem in the local environment around a plant that is encroaching on grassland and having effect in that local area. And then it's about working with sort of science, or how you can to work with something like a mycelium to create a building material. So it's a mixture of things that are going on there, but it's also very much embedded within the local community rather than sort of dropping something sort of in place.
So I have 2 more questions. One for Judith, which is, you know, how do you inspire, empower, equip people who are wanting to design, to use new types of materials, to think beyond steel and concrete, which, you know, we've been pushed into using in so many ways, and to actually explore those new spaces and, you know, and go out and design and create the markets for new products?
I think we take a step back actually from that, because when I hear you also talk, I think it is about what you said earlier, this almost proportionality, like how much do we use, but also what is appropriate. Or when we talk about indigenous, it's like, so how are we native to our place? How do we tap into the knowledge or local knowledge? So we work very place-based. We don't have our students in London, everybody's around the world. And what is very central is that as a designer, you start you start shifting the roles. So we talk more into that our students are like stewards. How do we nourish? How do we equip? How do we equip local communities? So it's almost about the non-design and the unlearning and kind of forgetting with how we've been brought up to think about design and putting new kind of methods and tools in place. So one of the things we look at is multi-species perspective, because it's quite something that design, what is a human tool to understand the world, we use to design for a non-human world. So how can we stay into our shoes, but still kind of look through different lenses to understand the needs of the others that we work with. And I think that's a very important shift in how can I understand the needs of others, because of course I might not be able to talk to plants, I do it daily, but how can I see them thrive? So how do we understand thriving? And I think that goes on many different levels in ways of practical ways, but also in how we understand being human together, or how can I understand textiles as my community? And if I understand them as a community or as a person, or I can address them in new ways, I can look at them, how they've been grown, how they've been sourced, how they support us. So it's a lot of, let's say it's a lot of mind shifting that we're doing, and just changing roles and looking through a lot of different lenses. And that's, it's really nice we have an MA, but I'm totally frustrated because they should just be embedded in all the curriculums, and it's not even for design students, actually.
Yeah, but it's hard being a pioneer, but it's got to start somewhere.
We need to start, and what is for me important is that we get it out of this massive institute, and CSM has been wonderful in like supporting it, but and we're partially online, but I also say I just want that our course becomes a small kind of group that really just builds a kind of massive rhizome network and expanding the knowledge to others. So we just become a community and actually stop paying high school fees, all inclusive. Because that's not talk about regenerative. It's not the content. It's also how do we teach and how do we make knowledge available.
Absolutely. And Michael, you talk about this in your book about the sort of agency of individuals, and don't be defeated. Don't fall into that trap of I can't because, which I hear all the time. I can't because my client hasn't asked me for it, or I can't because the material doesn't exist, or whatever. And I really like the very practical way you approach that in your book. Do you want to share?
Sure, I'm not sure exactly which bit you're referring to when you say the practical bit there, but yes. So we talk about what you were just saying there, the way that is very common for people to tend to minimise their agency, and I hear architects saying, well, there's not much we can do without a good client, and I hear people in the media saying, well, yeah, we'd love to cover these regenerative stories, but we have to give people what they want, and I even hear powerful clients saying, well, there's not much we can do without our shareholders and on board. And then someone told me there was a city mayor who said, well, look, I'm only the mayor. and we have to flip that, because that agency minimization tends to be kind of contagious. And when one of us minimizes our agency, it kind of allows other people to minimize theirs. But the good news is that if you do flip that, and if each of us seeks to maximize our agency, it could have a positive contagious effect. And really what we need is a kind of rolling wave of positive agency right across society up to the highest international levels. And there's plenty of good social science that backs this up. There's one bit of social science called something like 3 degrees of separation, where something that you do as an individual can have an effect, an influence on someone 3 steps removed from you. So people you don't even know, they may well change their perspective or behavior based on something you choose to do when you maximize your agency.
Yeah, and there's a lovely diagram in your book about the sort of spheres of influence that you have, on people that you know, but also people that you don't know. And therefore, it really encourages us all to put into practice what we believe in and speak up. Now, I was sat here by the organisers and told this was a great place to sit because I could see the clock, but they'd shone a bright light in my face. So I can't see the clock and I can't really see any of you. But I think it is sort of about time to ask all of you for if you have any questions for our panellists, or to just contribute to the discussion. Are you trying to put regenerative design into practice and hitting barriers? And you're going to have to point. Oh, good, the lights came on. That makes it a bit easier. Has anyone got anything that they would like to ask or contribute? You're all worn out. In the front here. Could you just, shout, yes, I think. Oh, no, a microphone's arriving.
Thank you. Joseph Hargrave, Arup. Michael, I can't remember how you described it. You spoke about kind of local, settlement, national, global, planetary scales or perspectives at the beginning. And I guess a common understanding of the importance of the planetary scale. I'm just wondering, in the context of what I would describe kind of individualization, polarization in society at the moment, where actually views are perhaps getting more extreme and more diverse rather than more harmonized. How do we deal with that social reality of views being quite radical and ingrained and polarized in much of today's political debate in the context of trying to achieve our objectives around regenerative design?
Well, that's a big question, and obviously a very topical one. And several of the previous sessions have talked about the importance of imagination, and I kind of despair sometimes when I see politicians saying things like, there are no solutions, only trade-offs, because that's just dire. And what we really need is better integrative thinking. And if we were to do that, we could overcome a lot of these problems. So, I think at the moment we're rather stuck in this kind of culture war of left versus right, and arguments about market versus state and so on. And we need to get beyond that so that we think in a much more integrated way. And I mean, just as one example, in 2021, the UK spent £4 billion on Russian oil. For the £3 billion, we could afford to make every bus fare in the UK free. We then wouldn't need to spend the planned £27 billion on expanding the road network. We could instead spend that on upgrading people's homes, starting with those most at risk of fuel poverty. And we'd probably still have money left over to do other important things. And so that would address the cost of living, climate change, Ukraine, obesity, congestion. And that's the kind of integrative approach that we need more politicians to take. But I'm worried that too many of our politicians come from an overprivileged background with the disadvantage of Eton educations that means they're not up to date with integrative thinking. Is that provocative enough?
Absolutely.
And they're not around long enough. That's the other problem.
Just to add to that and not add further oxygen.
Sorry, did you go to Eton?
No. Far from it. So actually, and I think the simplest way we can describe it is, whilst there might be so much we disagree on, there's also huge amounts we can agree on. And I think there's one example I can refer to. A couple of years ago, we joined an innovation mission with about 170 different NGOs and scientists and businesses exploring the plastic issue in the oceans. And one of the groups, I wasn't involved, but one of the groups from that mission came up with the idea of creating a UN treaty for plastics. And cut a long story short, 2 years later, they'd gone around basically all of the key stakeholders around the United Nations and formed an agreement that actually we can all agree that plastic in the ocean is just a bad thing and we need to stop it. And we can agree that we'll create a treaty at the UN level that is now being negotiated, and at the end of next year there will be signed into law a treaty on plastics, which has never existed before. And so I think there are examples where bold ambition and bold innovation can genuinely create change, and I think it's for all of us to kind of keep pushing that.
Absolutely agree. Any more? There's two, one behind and one in front, whichever way works.
Thanks, Michael, and others. So how I understand is that our crisis is essentially like a systemic barrier issue that reveals a deeper crisis in human consciousness. And you talk about spiral dynamics, for instance. So my question is more like, how is human consciousness in that regard applied in design leadership at companies like Arup?
Well, you can do companies like Arup. We've got other big companies here.
Yeah.
So, Arup, I don't want to proselytize about Arup. Arup's an unusual company. It was founded by a philosopher who then became an engineer. And so social conscience and philosophy is very much at the heart of who we are and the heart of day-to-day conversations. The company is owned by the employees. It's I think the biggest cooperative in the world. It's like John Lewis on steroids. Decisions are made based on whether things are the right thing to do. Ove talked about setting up a firm to be a force for good. Social usefulness is part of the values of the firm that come from the original speech he wrote 50 years ago. I think that Arup, we celebrated our 75th birthday. We lost a lot of that along the way. We have to navigate recessions like in 2008, like every other company. And when it's, you want work from your clients. It puts leaders in very difficult decisions. Leaders having to make very difficult decisions. At the moment, we are in a very good position where we have put sustainable development at the heart of our strategy. It means that every decision about the projects we do, the choices we make, that has to be part of the decision making. And we are turning down work as a result of that. And it's a journey. We absolutely haven't got the answers. We're 3 years in. I'm pleased with the progress that's been made. and yet every single leader in the firm is complaining that I'm trying to push them further and faster. I make no apology for that. But what this conversation is really about, business tends to look at a sort of 1 to 3 year horizon, maximum a 10-year horizon. And what I think is really important is that we look, beyond that. Arup is very lucky. We have a fabulous team, which is Arup's Foresight team, who have been responsible for putting this together and responsible for the exhibition in the room next door. And, they look at 30 years plus, and they're pulling us to imagine, challenge us to imagine different things. If there's one bit of the firm that I could grow tenfold, it would be that team. Because, they bring the sparkle, they bring the challenge to the status quo. And they do so in a way that's fun. And I do think that, to me, when I sort of think about what's needed to create a regenerative future, we've got to make it fun, guys. The amazing thing, if you want to change people's hearts and minds, you've got to make it fun.
You're going to stay alive, that's fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I add to that just briefly, Jo? So I think all companies and organizations need to ask themselves the question, what is our deep long-term purpose? I first heard Brian Eno ask that, and that was directed at individuals. What is your really long-term purpose? And by that, he didn't mean like a 10-year period. He meant, in 100 years' time, how might people remember you? And I think for a long time, people in business thought it was enough to just have a purpose about making profit. There's a guy called Peter Drucker, he's got a good quote on this. He said, profit for a company is like oxygen for a person. If you don't get enough of it, you're out of the game. But if you seriously think life is all about breathing, you're missing something.
That's brilliant. That's excellent. The gentleman behind you, I can just see.
Hi there, Ross Nicholson. I'm co-founder of a CIC in Derby around nature-based regeneration in the city centre, working with Eden Project. And just to end on some hope, and I hope you share it, is that we seem to be getting a lot more traction, I think, because there is a crisis on the high street. The city centres had to reach absolute rock bottom before we started to make real progress, and I just wondered whether you guys are seeing similar, or you would share that view.
Can I just jump in? I don't have really the answer yet, but I do think we talked about imagination, but I think this is urgency for this kind of alternative economies, but that we also kind of start not kind of just thinking out these kind of alternatives, but that we're really starting implementing them. So what you said, like, how are we actually practicing them? And I think that is an important thing. If I look at the students I'll be working with the next 2 years, we also said your graduation work is not just a paper to finish, but it's about building a legacy. So they have to gonna do things within their communities. They're not driven by themselves, but when they kind of step out of their project, the project still lives on in their community, either if it's for whoever they might be working for or with, or in what kind of context. And I think that is, again, that kind of equipping, or what you said about Arup's founder, like go from a philosopher to engineer. How can you equip the citizens? How can you equip your communities? And how do you equip also designers to kind of step out of their position so they can equip others? I can say the word equip 1,000 times, but it's so hard for us to kind of, we find it hard to equip ourselves beside the ego we have. So how do we do that for our communities? And how can we do that through design? So showing these kind of alternative scenarios, but actually doing them, that gives people also kind of hope, or a kind of optimism of, hey, we can build things, or we can use technology or new materials to do things, but we can also do it by the simple things of practicing being a community. Or I'm sure someone knows Top Morden. You have the incredible edible there. You come in and they grow the food around the streets, and people say, oh, is this carrot finished? No, it's not. I'll put it back. It doesn't work like that. But if we don't know how we live with it, or families say, well, I don't have time for that because I need to work to feed my kids. Well, we can teach you how to actually make positive income from growing the vegetables with your community. And these are just, I really believe in place-based, very local possibilities that lead either to social change, or what you talked about, mycelium, or how we build. And I think then there's a real kind of positive hope in that way. But I also believe in radical things, and that we dare, as from the creative scenes, can we please imagine things that can be totally upside down and out of a different paradigm, and that maybe don't have the gravity in us that we feel every day. Because, yeah, I think that's the beauty of what I love about our profession. We can imagine. And I think everybody can imagine. We just need to help them to imagine that and practice that.
Yeah. And Michael, mentioned the disruption that came from kind of COVID. We've got disruption. Our political system is falling apart. There's a recession around the corner. I think, we're going back to a world that I grew up in the 1970s, which was much more efficient, much less wasteful. My world was much closer to nature. We dug up the back garden to grow the vegetables. So I do know about carrots. But it's, I do think that the sort of, we've gone through this intense period of stability, and with that has come accumulation and acceptance that, the norm is the norm. And I think we are going into an era that is not about compliance, which has driven so much of the design world over the last, couple of decades, but really into a world of really creative thinking and creative solutions. And I think we do need to know where we want to get to, and if we can really dream about where we want to get to, really think about where we want to get to, and have the courage to experiment. I love the fact you've got a studio, that you're experimenting, and try things out, ask questions, share experiences, and just keep pushing the boundaries. We know we're on a pretty bad trajectory at the moment, and pretty much anything we do has got to be better. But I'm aware that we are going to be told to wrap up very quickly, so I wanted to thank the panel for their insights, and we'll do one very quick round. If there's one wish that you could have that would change things, one wish, what would it be? You can go in any order, the order you think about it.
I've got one if you want a bit more time.
No, go, yeah.
Oh, all right.
This is a small question to end on.
Yes. So in the book Flourish that I wrote with Sarah Ichioka, we spent quite a bit of time thinking about these kind of things. What are the really high-level systems changes we need? And if I had to choose just one, it would be that our country or respective countries join the Wellbeing Group of Governments. So this was set up initially by Scotland, Iceland, and New Zealand, defining a new purpose for their countries that wasn't just about endless growth, it was actually about well-being. They were later joined by Wales and Finland. And what I hope is that that initiative grows and eventually casts the G8 and the G20 into the shadows, because they are a dangerous bunch of extremists. They're not radicals. Radical, I think, is a good word. Radical is about getting to the root of things. They are dangerous extremists who actually keep things on the surface. Every time I think they can't get any more shallow, that somehow they drain a bit more water out of the pond and become more obsessed with growth. We need to bring that to an end as soon as possible. And the Wellbeing Group of Governments, I think, is the best way of doing that.
Great. That's great. Stephen?
Quite simply, that when we talk about cost, we talk about natural capital and not financial cost, primarily. And if we need to talk about the financial cost, then that's a sort of secondary aspect of the decision.
So to bring that into the accounting system alongside carbon.
Exactly.
Amy?
Yeah, I mean, both incredible suggestions to follow. I think there's been a lot of talk around education, and a wish would be that we integrate, really truly integrate thinking like regenerative design into not just being something separate, but is taught in every single course. I mean, what we see is so many of the sort of the companies that are trying to do things differently are not actually founded by scientists who you might think would be founding a biotech company. So empowering people to go, how do you look at problems differently? I think that the teams that are the most successful are multidisciplinaries, but I think it's really giving, not sort of tacking it on at the end, but really getting people to think about a truly successful design material company integrates regenerative design from the beginning, not as an afterthought.
Are the wishes granted? Because then we'll have a few. I think my central one is really that there's a new understanding of relatedness. I think it's so central to understanding kind of a deep web of life. And I know permaculture was mentioned earlier in another session, and those are things like, how do we understand how things are connected and what kind of effect you have, what are the consequences and the things. So understanding that things are related just shifts us from this kind of consumption modus to a participant, and we're participants together.
Great. And my wish is simply that all of you, as a result of being here today, and thank you for being here, think a bit differently, and as a result, actually do something differently as a result of being here today. Whether that's connect to someone else here, or challenge your client, or design something differently, or experiment, or just learn, because we all need to keep learning faster than the world is changing around us. And learning is fun. So thank you very much, and thank you again to the panel.